The scent of vaporized synthetic leather and my own carbonized skin is a specific, suffocating vintage I will never unsmell. It was a Tuesday in 2023, somewhere along a treacherous, rain-slicked stretch of the Pacific Coast Highway. The heavy, twisted titanium frame of my Audi had collapsed inward, driving the steering column directly against my sternum. The pressure was absolute, pinning my ribs against my spine. I could not inhale. I could not scream. Through the spider-webbed fractures of the windshield, bathed in the erratic, strobe-like flashes of failing halogen headlights, I saw her face. Chloe. She leaned out of the driver's side of her crumpled SUV, the vehicle she had just weaponized against me. A jagged laceration split her forehead, the blood mixing with the relentless California rain, but she did not seem to feel it. Her pupils were blown wide, consuming her irises in a pitch-black tide of pathological jealousy and sheer, unadulterated madness. If I can't have your life, Arya, neither of us will. Her shriek cut through the deafening hiss of pouring rain on superheated engine blocks. It was the last sound I heard before the spark met the ruptured fuel line. The explosion did not register as sound, but as a kinetic wave that liquefied the air in my lungs. The blinding orange inferno swallowed the world, melting my eyelashes to my cheeks, peeling my existence down to ash. And then I inhaled. My lungs did not draw in scorching plasma. They filled with crisp, climate-controlled air, heavy with the sharp, leathery tang of Cohiba cigars and aged Macallan scotch. My spine snapped ramrod straight against a high-backed leather chair, my hands clamped down on the smooth, polished armrests. My vision swam, struggling to reconcile the blinding fire of my death with the muted, amber-lit shadows of the room. No blood, no crushed bones, no suffocating smoke. The rhythmic, wealthy tick-tock of a Patek Philippe mantel clock anchored me to the present second. The brass hands pointed to 10:14 a.m. The date window displayed October 14th, 2019. A single drop of cold sweat traced the curve of my spine. I lowered my gaze to my hands. The skin was flawless. There were no defensive fractures on my wrists from Julian's violent tantrums. There were no deep, permanent calluses on my fingertips from the thousands of hours I had spent in a dark server room, secretly writing the predictive logistics algorithms that had built my fake husband's silicon empire. I was 22 again. The timeline had snapped back like a severed rubber band. The Thorn legacy is hemorrhaging cash, and neither of you seems to grasp the severity of the ledger. My father, Arthur Thorn, rasped. He sat behind his massive mahogany desk, his face a landscape of deep, exhausted, gray lines. I blinked, the clinical detachment settling into my chest, freezing over the residual panic of my fiery death. I was sitting in my father's study. To my right stood Chloe, wearing a pristine white silk dress that clung to her perfectly curated innocence. But beneath the facade, her breathing was shallow, erratic. Her manicured nails dug into her palms so hard the knuckles shone white. I studied her. The realization clicked into place with absolute precision. The sheer desperation in her posture, the manic, predatory gleam in her eyes. Chloe remembered. She had been reborn, too. She remembered the fire on the highway, but more importantly, she remembered the glossy magazine covers. She remembered Julian Vance smiling on the front of Forbes as the golden boy of Silicon Valley. She remembered the sprawling penthouses and the yachts. She remembered my life, and she had come back to steal it. I have secured two alliances that will keep our name afloat. My father continued, sliding two thick, cream-colored dossiers across the reflective surface of the mahogany desk. One is with Sebastian Cross of Cross Capital. The other is with Julian Vance. Julian is currently seeking seed funding for a tech firm. I want Julian. Chloe's voice cut through the room. She lunged forward, slamming both hands flat onto the polished wood and rattling the crystal decanter. I am sorry, what? My father asked, entirely caught off guard by the violent breach of decorum. In our previous timeline, it had taken him 3 hours of enduring Chloe's screaming and throwing porcelain vases before she reluctantly accepted the other contract. I said I will marry Julian Vance, Chloe stated, her chest heaving, her eyes burned with a blinding, greedy fervor. I have always admired his visionary mind. I am going to build an empire with him from the ground up. Aria is too fragile for a tech startup. She should marry the corporate raider. She should marry Sebastian. My father blinked, stunned by this sudden display of supposed sibling sacrifice. He looked at me, a pathetic mixture of guilt and immense relief washing over his tired features. He had expected to fight tooth and nail to force one of his daughters to take the destitute, unproven nerd. I held my ground. My composure was absolute and unbreakable. I expertly concealed the dark, hysterical triumph roaring in my mind. Oh, Chloe, you absolute magnificent fool. She thought Julian was the golden ticket. She thought he was a self-made billionaire. She didn't know that Julian Vance could not write a functional Python script if his life depended on it. She didn't know about the nights I was locked away, starved, forced to debug the core software while Julian was out snorting cocaine with venture capitalists. She didn't know about the gaslighting, the bruised ribs, the wire fraud. She had only seen the end result. And now, blinded by envy, she was sprinting eagerly into the very cage that had tortured me for years. Aria won't mind, will you, sweetie? Chloe mocked, turning to me. The venom beneath her tone was absolute. You always liked quiet men anyway. I raised my head slowly. I let my eyes widen just a fraction, playing the part of the stunned, compliant sister to absolute perfection. If that is what Chloe truly desires, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, smooth and devoid of any friction. I will honor the family's arrangement, father. Pass me the Mont Blanc. The heavy Mont Blanc Meisterstück, a platinum-coated fountain pen, rested on a green leather blotter. I reached out. My fingers wrapped around the cold, black resin. It weighed exactly 42 grams, a dense, physical anchor pulling me permanently away from the ashes of my past life. I pulled the dossier toward me. It was not just a marriage contract. It was a heavily armored prenuptial agreement, 40 pages of dense legalese designed to protect the family trust of the Cross dynasty. I slowly unscrewed the cap. The internal threads ground together with a microscopic, metallic whisper. I aligned the gold nib with the signature line on the final page. The air in the room felt suspended, holding its breath. My father watched me, exhaling a sigh that spoke of his fiduciary duty being fulfilled. I pressed the nib to the thick ivory parchment. The ink bled into the paper, a deep, arterial, midnight blue. The friction of the metal against the grain produced a distinct, surgical scratch. Scritch, scritch, louder than the ticking clock, louder than Chloe's ragged, anticipating breaths. I formed the A, sharp and deliberate. Each subsequent letter of Aria Thorne was a methodical severing of my past, a silent execution of the victim I used to be. The scent of the ink, sharp and chemical, mixed with the aged cedar of the desk. I was signing my life over to Sebastian Cross, a ruthless private equity titan whispered to be entirely incapable of human emotion, a man who liquidated century old companies without blinking. I lifted the pen. The final dot over the I settled. The trap was locked. I placed the pen down precisely parallel to the document. I did not look at my father. I looked directly into Chloe's eyes. She let out a breath she had been holding, snatching Julian's contract off the desk and clutching it to her chest as if she had just robbed a bank vault. A smug, radiant smile spread across her face, the pure toxic triumph of a thief. I did not speak. I merely offered her a silent, chilling smile, a micro expression that barely tugged at the corners of my mouth. It was the look of an apex predator watching a mouse enthusiastically trigger its own guillotine. Thank you, Father, Chloe beamed, practically skipping out of the heavy oak doors, already calculating how quickly she could spend Julian's non existent billions. I remained in the chair for a moment longer, the silence of the study washing over me. I stood up, smoothing the invisible wrinkles from my navy skirt, and walked to the floor to ceiling window overlooking the circular driveway. The rain had just begun to fall, dusting the manicured hedges. Tires crunched over the wet gravel. A massive, heavily armored black Maybach glided to a halt before the front steps. The tinted rear window was a black void, impenetrable and terrifying to the rest of the world. The monster of Silicon Valley had arrived to claim his bride. I pressed my fingertips against the cold glass of the window. My reflection stared back at me, the ghost of an algorithm architect ready to burn the tech world to its foundations. Let's go home, Sebastian. The heavy front doors of the Thorne estate clicked open, and the temperature in the foyer seemed to drop 10 degrees. Footsteps, measured and heavy with unspoken authority, echoed on the marble tiles. Sebastian Cross had entered the building, bringing a manila folder that would either be my ultimate salvation or a much colder, darker prison. The Pacific Heights estate of Sebastian Cross was not a home. It was a fortress of glass, dark steel, and brutalist concrete suspended above the San Francisco fog. I stood in the center of the master suite, still suffocating in the heavy Prada reception gown selected by his public relations team. The floor to ceiling windows offered a panoramic, glittering view of the Golden Gate Bridge, but the temperature inside the room was absolute zero. In my previous life, my wedding night with Julian Vance had been an alcohol fueled barrage of rough, uncalculated possession in a cramped South Loop apartment. I tightened my jaw, bracing my core muscles against the inevitable intrusion. The heavy oak door clicked open. Sebastian stepped over the threshold. He had discarded his tailored suit jacket and unbuttoned the top two buttons of his crisp Tom Ford shirt, exposing the faint shadow of a collarbone. He did not look at me with the predatory hunger I had braced for. His winter sky eyes were surgical, scanning the room with the efficiency of a machine processing ambient data. He did not close the distance between us. Instead, he walked directly to the low profile glass coffee table in the center of the sitting area. He dropped a thick, unbranded manila folder onto the glass. The sharp thwack of heavy paper striking the table echoed against the sound-proofed walls. Sit, Arya, he instructed. His baritone voice lacked any trace of malice. It was merely the tone of a man accustomed to total, unquestioned compliance. I perched on the edge of the velvet sofa, my spine rigid. Sebastian poured exactly 2 fingers of Macallan into a crystal tumbler, taking a slow, measured sip. He did not offer me one. I am a man who values absolute transparency and frictionless operations, Sebastian began, his gaze locking onto mine. My board of directors requires a CEO with a stabilized domestic image. Your father required an immediate injection of capital to avoid a margin call. This marriage is an acquisition. Inside that folder is our operational contract. I reached out, my fingernails tracing the edge of the coarse paper before flipping it open. You will receive an unrestricted operational allowance of $200,000 a month, Sebastian dictated, his voice a steady drone of commerce. You are free to occupy the adjoining suite, decorate the estate, or travel globally. You will find an anodized titanium centurion card in the left pocket. There is no limit for expenses related to your wardrobe, philanthropy, or public appearances. In exchange, I require your presence at 2 public galas per month and absolute discretion. You will cause no scandals that could impact the stock price of Cross Capital. Our bedrooms are separate. I have my privacy, and you will have yours. He finished his scotch, setting the tumbler down with a definitive clink. Do we have an understanding? The rigid, defensive tension locking my cervical spine completely dissolved. My heart rate, which had been hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, decelerated to a slow, steady pulse. Sebastian Cross was not demanding my soul nor my body. He was demanding a frictionless transaction. He was offering me the 3 exact elements I required to orchestrate a slaughter: limitless capital, impenetrable safety, and absolute isolation. We have an understanding, Sebastian, I replied smoothly, closing the folder. We have an understanding, Sebastian, I replied smoothly, closing the folder. He offered a curt nod, turning toward his private dressing room. Before he vanished, he paused, looking over his shoulder. I had my executive chef review your medical records. I am aware of your severe anaphylactic allergy to strawberries. They have been permanently eradicated from the estate kitchens, and the staff has been briefed under NDA. Good night, Aria. The door clicked shut, leaving me entirely alone in the massive suite. A phantom ache throbbed in my right radius bone. The sensory memory of my past life triggered unbidden, the acrid smell of burning bread popping from a cheap toaster. Julian's heavy hand wrapping around my frail wrist, twisting until the bone produced a sickening wet crunch. You burned my toast, you dumb bitch. Who's going to believe a hysterical housewife over the Silicon Valley golden boy? Julian's venomous spit had landed on my cheek as I collapsed to the linoleum floor, clutching my fractured arm. I stared at the closed door of Sebastian's suite. A man the financial press called a dead-hearted sociopath had scoured my medical records to ensure my physical safety on night 1. Julian, the charismatic visionary, had routinely bought me strawberry pastries to watch me refuse them, just so he could berate me for being ungrateful. The ghost of the terrified housewife evaporated, leaving only the architect. No one needs to believe a housewife, I thought, the metallic taste of adrenaline flooding my palate. They only need to believe the math. I moved into the sprawling, soundproofed adjoining suite the next morning. I did not use my new allowance to purchase Birkin bags or Cartier bracelets. I was not building a wardrobe. I was building an arsenal. I sat at the empty teak desk, opening the manila folder to retrieve the black centurion card. The anodized titanium was shockingly heavy, a dense, cold rectangle of concentrated economic power resting in the center of my palm. The laser-etched numbers caught the morning light filtering through the fogged windows. I booted up my encrypted laptop. The mechanical keyboard, fitted with cherry MX blue switches, weighted beneath my fingertips. I opened the Tor browser, routing my connection through 3 offshore VPNs before accessing the Delaware Division of Corporations portal. The keystrokes were sharp, staccato gunshots in the quiet room. I registered a blind shell corporation, the entity name Omni Solutions LLC, registered agent, anonymous, ultimate beneficial owner, entirely obfuscated behind layers of legal armor. Next, I opened the B2B portal for a highly restricted, military grade hardware supplier in Silicon Valley. I began to build my cart: dual curved retina displays, quantum encryption routers, and the crown jewels, 3 towering liquid-cooled mainframes capable of processing exabytes of logistical data per second without generating a thermal footprint. The total balance blinked at the bottom of the screen: $157,450. My thumb traced the raised, embossed numbers on the titanium card. The metal absorbed the ambient heat from my skin. I pressed the card down onto the desk, my left index finger anchoring it while my right hand moved to the keyboard. 4, 3, 9, 2. The mechanical resistance of the keys required exactly 50 grams of actuation force. I felt the precise, tactile bump of the switch engaging beneath the plastic cap. 5, 8, 0, 1. I wasn't just entering a billing sequence, I was loading the magazine of a sniper rifle aimed directly at Julian Vance's fraudulent empire. I could smell the faint metallic tang of ozone from the laptop's exhaust fan, mixing with the scent of salt water blowing in from the bay. Expiration. CVV. The cursor blinked steadily in the authorize field. I inhaled, expanding my diaphragm, holding the oxygen in my lungs. My index finger hovered over the enter key. This was Sebastian's money. This was the exact moment the transactional marriage morphed into a weapon of mass financial destruction. The transaction required a direct wire transfer authorization from the Cross Capital holding accounts. I pressed the key down. The screen froze for a fraction of a second, a digital heartbeat, before the portal dissolved into a loading wheel. The pixelated circle spun. The silence in the room amplified the rushing of blood in my own ears. Payment approved. Wire transfer initiated. The confirmation screen flooded the display, casting a harsh, brilliant blue light across the dark desk. The cerulean glow reflected perfectly in the center of my pupils. I did not smile. I simply closed the laptop, the satisfying snap of the magnetic hinge sealing the trap. Within 72 hours, the east wing of the Pacific Heights estate was unrecognizable. The liquid-cooled mainframes arrived in unmarked crates and were installed in my suite. The low, relentless hum of the cooling pumps vibrated through the floorboards, a synthetic heartbeat pulsing beneath my bare feet. I lived on black espresso and the burning, incandescent need for vengeance. For 18 hours a day, the code flowed from my fingertips like a native tongue. I was constructing the Ether protocol, the logistics algorithm Julian had stolen to build his fake empire. But I wasn't just recreating it. I was rewriting it from scratch, stripping out the bloated inefficiencies I had been forced to leave in during my past life, engineering it to run 10 times faster, flawlessly encrypted, and entirely untraceable to Arya Thorne. To the world outside this room, I was the quiet, compliant trophy wife of a billionaire. Inside the glow of the monitors, I was the ghost architect. 3 floors down, in the immaculate, sterile environment of the estate's main administrative office, Silas, Sebastian's fiercely loyal executive assistant, stared at the monthly utility ledger. He tapped a Mont Blanc pen against a printed invoice from Pacific Gas and Electric. The East Wing's power consumption had skyrocketed by a staggering 400% in a single billing cycle. Silas placed the invoice directly into the center of Sebastian's mahogany desk. Sebastian picked up the paper, his winter sky eyes scanning the astronomical number. He slowly lifted his gaze, staring through the ceiling directly toward the floorboards of my locked suite. He reached for his pen. Sebastian did not knock on my locked oak door. He did not dispatch Silas to interrogate me. Instead, 48 hours after reviewing the catastrophic utility bill, a fleet of commercial-grade electrical contractors arrived at the Pacific Heights estate. I watched from the second-story landing as they hauled heavy-duty transformers and industrial copper wiring into the basement. Sebastian had quietly upgraded the estate's grid to accommodate a server farm, absorbing the exorbitant cost into his personal ledger without a single question. He had honored our operational contract to the letter. He provided the fortress. He did not ask what war I was preparing for inside it. 6 months slipped by in a rhythm of relentless, hyper-productive isolation. By March 2020, the Ether protocol was complete. It was no longer a theoretical string of Python code. It was a breathing, ravenous digital organism. I had fed it 3 years of historical global shipping data, simulating port strikes, crude oil price fluctuations, and catastrophic weather patterns. The algorithm devoured the variables and output optimized shipping routes in real time. The optimization rate settled at a staggering 99.4%. It was a masterpiece of back-end architecture, mathematically flawless. Across the bay, the Silicon Valley grapevine was whispering a very different story about Julian Vance. The industry rumors were a low, persistent buzz that I monitored via encrypted tech forums. Julian's startup was hemorrhaging cash. He had secured a meager Series A funding round based on his charismatic, empty promises, but without me locked in a closet writing the actual code, his developers were hitting a brick wall. His user interface was a glossy, crashing shell with zero back-end processing power. His burn rate was accelerating toward total bankruptcy. It was time to introduce the ghost. I sat in the ergonomic chair before my dual curved monitors. The liquid-cooled mainframes hummed, pushing cool air against my ankles. I opened an untraceable encrypted email client. I compiled a restricted 30-day beta version of the Ether protocol into an executable file, locking it behind a proprietary self-destruct sequence. I populated the BCC field with the direct email addresses of the chief technology officers of the 5 largest logistics conglomerates in North America. The cursor blinked on the blank body of the email. I typed a single surgical sentence. Test this predictive shipping algorithm against your current routing. When you save your first 10 million, we can discuss the licensing fee. I signed it simply, CH Architect. My index finger rested on the cold plastic of the left mouse button. The cursor hovered over the send icon. For half a second, the sensory memory of Julian's heavy boot kicking my ribs flared in my peripheral nervous system. I exhaled, feeling the precise, tactile click of the mouse beneath my fingertip. The progress bar flashed across the screen. Message sent. The trap was primed. 2 nights later, the physical and digital worlds collided at the annual Drake Hotel Winter Charity Gala. It was one of the 2 mandatory appearances required by my operational contract. I stood in front of the vanity mirror in my suite, wrapped in a floor-length emerald Prada gown selected by Sebastian's stylist. The heavy silk grazed my collarbones, contrasting sharply with the icy brilliance of the Harry Winston diamond necklace resting against my sternum. I swept my hair into a severe, sleek twist. There was no trace of the battered, exhausted woman who had died on a burning highway. When Sebastian and I stepped into the grand ballroom of the Drake Hotel, the atmosphere shifted. The ambient chatter of the elite dropped by several decibels. The blinding strobes of paparazzi cameras flared in rapid succession, a relentless, white-hot assault on my retinas. Sebastian placed a large, firm hand flat against the small of my back. The heat of his palm bled through the emerald silk. It wasn't a romantic gesture, it was a physical barrier, a proprietary warning to the vultures circling the room. Keep your chin up, Aria, Sebastian murmured, his resonant baritone vibrating just an inch from my earlobe. The scent of his oud wood cologne briefly masked the overpowering odor of expensive champagne and hothouse lilies. The press smells blood tonight. Don't give them a single drop. We hadn't been standing near the ice sculpture for 10 minutes before the disturbance approached. Aria, Sebastian! The shrill, desperate frequency of Chloe's voice pierced the low hum of a jazz quartet playing in the corner. I turned slowly, my crystal champagne flute perfectly level in my grip. Chloe was dragging Julian by the wrist, carving a jagged path through the throng of venture capitalists. She wore a gaudy, sequined gold dress that caught the light of the chandeliers in a cheap, scattered spray. But it was her face that demanded my clinical focus. Beneath a heavy, inexpertly applied layer of foundation on her left cheekbone, the distinct purplish yellow shadow of a contusion bloomed. My stomach tightened. The phantom ache echoed in my own bones. Julian's temper had already surfaced. Without the billions to keep his narcissistic ego pacified, his rage had found a new, willing target. It's so wonderful to see you both. Chloe forced a brittle, skeletal smile that failed to reach her panicked blue eyes. Julian and I have just been rubbing elbows with the Vanguard Logistics Board. Julian Vance looked terrible. His sandy hair, usually perfectly coiffed for magazine covers, was slightly unkempt. The bespoke tailoring of his suit could not hide the exhausted, manic twitch near his left eye. He forced his trademark charismatic grin, extending a slightly trembling hand toward my husband. Mr. Cross, an honor, Julian projected, his voice a hollow echo of the man I used to fear. Vance Innovations is actively exploring a hostile takeover defense strategy, but primarily we are entering a crucial funding round. I'd love to get on your calendar to discuss a potential synergy. The silence that stretched between the four of us was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. The ice cubes in my glass shifted, clinking sharply against the crystal. Sebastian did not take Julian's hand. He let it hang suspended in the sterile air between them for a long, agonizing 5 seconds. The subtle facial muscles around Julian's jaw tightened, the blood draining from his charismatic smile. My calendar is managed by Silas, Sebastian replied smoothly, his tone devoid of any inflection. Though I must admit, I prefer investing in tangible architecture, not conceptual theories. A flash of raw, unfiltered anger twisted Julian's features. He dropped his hand. It's not a theory. We're finalizing the beta for a predictive shipping algorithm that will completely dominate the market. Then I look forward to evaluating it when it actually exists. Sebastian countered, his winter sky eyes entirely unbothered by Julian's desperate posturing. Julian's fists clenched, the veins in his neck stood out in stark relief. Chloe, sensing the imminent collapse of her golden ticket, physically stepped between the two men, turning her frantic gaze to me. She stepped uncomfortably close. I could smell the sour metallic tang of fear sweat cutting through her expensive Chanel perfume. Her nails dug painfully into the bare skin of my forearm. Startups are stressful, Aria, Chloe hissed, her voice dropping to a harsh, desperate whisper under the cover of the jazz band. Julian is a genius. He just needs time. He just needs a little capital. Her grip tightened, bruising my flesh. Father won't return my calls. We need a bridge loan, just $500,000. Ask Sebastian. You owe me for this life, Aria. I did not flinch. I did not pull my arm away. I stared down at her trembling, manicured fingers digging into my arm, then slowly raised my eyes to meet hers. I owe you nothing, Chloe, I stated, my voice a flat, dead calm. You chose Julian. You chose the struggle. I didn't need to finish the sentence. The absolute authority of the Cross Empire stepped in. Remove your hand from my Prada gown, I said, pausing just a fraction of a second before delivering the kill shot, before my husband removes it for you. Sebastian shifted his weight, his broad shoulders physically blocking Julian's line of sight to me. He didn't raise his voice, but the lethal, terrifying gravity in his tone sucked the oxygen out of the immediate radius. Keep your wife on a leash, Vance, Sebastian commanded softly, or I will buy your debt tomorrow morning and orchestrate a hostile takeover to liquidate your entire operation by Friday. Julian physically recoiled as if he had been struck with a cattle prod. He immediately grabbed Chloe's elbow, his fingers digging brutally into her bicep, ripping her away from me. Apologies, Mr. Cross. Chloe has had a bit too much champagne. Let's go, darling. As Julian dragged her away, Chloe looked back at me over her shoulder. The realization was finally dawning in her panicked, tear-filled eyes. The timeline was irreparably broken. The billionaire she thought she had stolen was a broke, abusive fraud. I watched them disappear into the crowd. I lifted my crystal flute and took a slow, deliberate sip of the chilled champagne. You don't like them, Sebastian murmured, adjusting his cufflinks. Your pulse accelerated the moment they approached. They are complicated, I offered carefully. Sebastian tracked Julian's retreating figure. Vance is a snake oil salesman. He has no underlying architecture for his software. His burn rate is catastrophic. If he asks you for money again, tell me. I will crush his firm by Tuesday. I hid my smile behind the rim of my glass. No need, Sebastian, I thought, the cold champagne sliding down my throat. I'm going to do it by Monday. Less than 48 hours after the gala, the encrypted inbox in my server room erupted. The CTO of Vanguard Logistics had run my beta test on a single trans-Pacific shipping route. The financial press was suddenly flooded with leaked rumors of an anonymous ghost algorithm. Julian Vance, completely unaware that his execution had already been scheduled, had somehow managed to secure a desperate final pitch meeting at Cross Capital. He was walking directly into the slaughterhouse. The executive floor of Cross Capital was a sterile, high-altitude ecosystem designed to induce vertigo in the weak. Suspended 60 stories above the financial district, the ambient noise of the city was completely neutralized by triple-paned acoustic glass. The silence up here was absolute, heavy with the scent of ozone and hundreds of millions of dollars exchanging hands. I rarely utilized the clearance my operational contract granted me to the executive levels. I preferred the humming sanctuary of my server room, but today the gravity of the execution pulled me from the Pacific Heights estate. I bypassed the polished reception desk, carrying a discreetly branded paper bag containing a catered lunch from Sebastian's preferred Italian bistro. Silas, standing guard outside the main boardroom, caught my eye. A microscopic nod was the only acknowledgment he offered before he tapped a key fob, unlocking a secure side door. I slipped inside the viewing gallery. The room was narrow, heavily carpeted, and completely dark, save for the ambient light bleeding through the expansive one-way mirror that formed the entire eastern wall. Through the glass, I had an unobstructed panoramic view of the Cross Capital boardroom. The 20-foot mahogany conference table dominated the space, polished to a mirror shine. At the head of the table sat Sebastian. He was flanked by three senior quantitative analysts, but they were merely set dressing. Sebastian dominated the spatial geometry of the room. He sat perfectly still, his hands steepled beneath his chin, his winter sky eyes fixed on the man sweating at the opposite end of the vast expanse of wood, Julian Vance. I set the Italian takeout bag onto a small side table. The crinkle of the heavy paper seemed deafening in the isolated gallery. I pulled up a high-backed leather chair, sinking into the darkness, and unboxed a black truffle risotto. I placed a silver fork perfectly parallel to the container. Through the glass, the pantomime of Julian's desperation began. Julian's bespoke suit, which had looked merely rumpled at the charity gala, now hung on him as if he had recently shed 10 pounds of muscle mass. The charismatic, relaxed posture that had graced the cover of Forbes in my past life was gone. He was twitching, a nervous, erratic energy vibrating through his limbs. He clicked a presentation remote. A massive flat-screen monitor on the wall behind Sebastian flared to life. It displayed a glossy, over-designed PowerPoint presentation. The title slide screamed, "Vance Innovations, the Future of Predictive Routing." "Mr. Cross," Julian began. His voice, stripped of its usual arrogant boom, sounded thin and reedy, struggling to cross the acoustic expanse of the long table. "Vance Innovations is on the precipice of finalizing the core architecture that will fundamentally dominate the global shipping market. Our burn rate is merely a reflection of aggressive talent acquisition." I picked up the silver fork. I took a small bite of the risotto. The earthy, rich taste of truffle bloomed across my palate. "We just need a $5 million Series A injection to complete the beta testing phase," Julian continued, clicking to a slide filled with hollow ascending bar graphs and meaningless buzzwords. "With Cross Capital's backing, we can deploy within the quarter." Sebastian did not even glance at the illuminated screen. He remained entirely focused on Julian, dissecting the man's posture with the clinical detachment of an entomologist pinning a moth to a corkboard. "Vance," Sebastian's baritone cut through Julian's rehearsed pitch, instantly killing the momentum in the room. "Have you read the Financial Times this morning?" Julian blinked rapidly. A single bead of cold sweat detached from his hairline, tracing a slow, agonizing path down his temple. The microscopic movement was magnified under the harsh, recessed LED lighting of the boardroom. I, I skimmed the headlines," Julian stammered, his fingers tightening around the plastic presentation remote until his knuckles blanched white. "Then you missed the article detailing a new software deployment from a Delaware entity called Omni Solutions," Sebastian stated smoothly. He did not raise his voice. He did not lean forward. I watched Sebastian's right hand move. He picked up a sleek, obsidian-backed iPad from the table. The friction of the metallic casing sliding across the polished mahogany was a low, resonant shh. that I imagined I could hear even through the soundproof glass. He slid the device down the length of the 20-foot table. It decelerated perfectly, coming to a halt precisely 2 inches from Julian's rigidly planted hands. A beta was released to 5 major logistics firms 3 days ago, Sebastian continued, his voice the auditory equivalent of liquid nitrogen. It already executes what you claim your theoretical software will do, but it operates with a confirmed, audited 99.4% accuracy rate. I chewed slowly, my jaw moving in infinitesimal increments, my eyes locked on Julian's face. My own logistics division tested the Omni deployment yesterday afternoon, Sebastian added, delivering the kill shot with effortless precision. It saved my firm $400,000 in maritime fuel routing in 4 hours. Julian stared down at the illuminated screen of the iPad, the blood completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. His jaw slackened, the charismatic visionary facade violently shattered, revealing the terrified, hollow fraud beneath. That is impossible, Julian protested in absolute shock. He reached a trembling hand toward the iPad, but stopped short of touching it, as if the screen itself were irradiated. No one else was working on this architecture. We had a proprietary build. We have the You have a failing user interface and a massive, unrecoverable debt structure. Sebastian interrupted, his tone suddenly devoid of any patience or pity. You came into my boardroom to sell me a concept that has already been perfected, packaged, and deployed by a nameless competitor. Julian looked like he had been physically struck in the sternum. He staggered backward, his thigh knocking painfully against the heavy leather chair behind him. Mr. Cross, please, Julian pleaded, his voice breaking under the crushing reality. The Omni code must be flawed. If you just give us a month to analyze it, we can reverse engineer. Your company is obsolete, Vance. The pitch is over, Sebastian declared. He did not look at Julian again. He picked up a Mont Blanc pen and turned his attention to a physical ledger on his desk. Silas, Sebastian commanded with absolute authority. The heavy mahogany doors at the rear of the boardroom opened instantly. Silas, accompanied by 2 massive corporate security officers in charcoal suits, stepped into the room. Escort Mr. Vance out. Sebastian, wait! You cannot just. Julian lunged forward, slamming his hands onto the table. The 2 security officers moved with terrifying fluid speed. They flanked Julian, grabbing him by the biceps, physically lifting him off the plush carpet. Julian thrashed, his presentation remote clattering onto the floor and shattering into pieces. The hollow, fabricated empire he had built on the back of my stolen labor was crumbling to dust in exactly 5 minutes. As they dragged him backward through the heavy doors, I placed my silver fork down on the napkin. My conscience was entirely clear. The fear was gone. My mind was completely devoid of vindictive euphoria. What I experienced was a cold, profound, geometric satisfaction. The equation had been balanced. I watched Silas pick up the shattered pieces of the presentation remote from the carpet, drop them into a trash receptacle, and close the boardroom doors, sealing Sebastian back into his absolute domain. I packed up the remains of the Italian lunch. I wiped my mouth with a linen napkin, ensuring not a single crumb or drop of truffle oil remained in the dark viewing gallery. I stepped out the side door before Sebastian emerged from the main suite. When I arrived back at the Thorne family estate later that afternoon for my mother's mandatory Sunday tea, the fallout from the boardroom execution had already triggered a seismic shock wave. The sprawling, manicured estate felt entirely different now. It didn't feel like a prison or a prize to be won. It just felt like a tired, drafty old house filled with ghosts. I bypassed the drawing room and walked directly up the grand staircase toward my old childhood bedroom. The heavy oak door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open. Chloe was sitting in the center of the hardwood floor. The space around her was a chaotic wasteland of shredded wedding photographs and torn bridal magazines. She was not the glowing, arrogant socialite who had practically skipped out of the study a year ago. Her blonde hair was a tangled, unkempt mess. Her eyes were bloodshot, the makeup smeared in dark, chaotic streaks down her pale cheeks. She wore a white silk blouse, but the collar was violently torn, exposing an angry red scratch along her collarbone. She looked up when I entered. A feral, unhinged energy radiated from her trembling frame. "He hit me," she whispered, her voice cracking, completely devoid of its usual saccharine venom. I closed the bedroom door quietly and leaned my shoulders against the cool wood, crossing my arms over my cashmere coat. My face remained an emotionless mask. "Julian came home," Chloe choked out, wrapping her arms around her knees, rocking slightly. "He threw a crystal glass against the wall, and he hit me. He said we are bankrupt. He said some anonymous company stole his idea and ruined him. He's going to liquidate assets. He's talking about emptying the accounts." "I warned you he was struggling, Chloe," I stated flatly, my voice devoid of any inflection. She scrambled to her feet, stumbling slightly on the hem of her torn skirt, kicking aside the shredded pieces of a photograph showing Julian smiling for a magazine spread. "No, you don't understand." She lunged toward me, her hands grabbing my shoulders, shaking me with a frantic, terrifying strength. "This isn't how it's supposed to happen." I did not flinch. I did not push her away. I merely stared into her bloodshot, dilated pupils. "In the other life, he was a billionaire." Chloe screamed, the burden of 2 lifetimes of jealousy and catastrophic failure finally snapping her mind. "He was on the cover of Forbes. He loved you and gave you everything. Sebastian was supposed to be the monster. You were supposed to be miserable in that giant, empty house." She had finally cracked. The timeline was irreparably broken, and her fragile reality was collapsing inward. I did not feign ignorance. I did not play dumb. I was done hiding in the shadows. I reached up, my hands perfectly steady, and peeled her trembling, manicured fingers off the fabric of my cashmere coat. I leaned in until my face was inches from hers, dropping my voice to a lethal, freezing whisper that promised total annihilation. "Julian never loved me, Chloe. Julian locked me in closets, and he didn't write a single line of that code." My hands were perfectly steady as I reached up. I clamped my fingers over Chloe's wrists, pressing just hard enough into the fragile radial bones to sever her frantic, bruising grip on my cashmere coat. I peeled her hands away, stepping back to establish a precise geometric boundary between my physical space and her collapsing reality. "Julian never loved me, Chloe," I stated, my voice laced with a clinical, freezing calm. The acoustic dampening of the childhood bedroom seemed to swallow the words, amplifying their lethality. "He didn't hand me a tech empire. Julian locked me in closets. He fractured my wrist because the ambient temperature of his espresso was incorrect. He drained my bank accounts and isolated me from the world." Chloe froze. The violent tremors racking her thin frame abruptly ceased. Her eyes, ringed in smeared, expensive mascara, widened in absolute paralyzing horror. "No," she choked out, a guttural sound scraping against her vocal cords. "No, the magazines, the Forbes cover." The magazines were a PR campaign paid for by the capital I generated, I continued, taking a single, deliberate step toward her. She instinctively retreated, her spine hitting the edge of the mahogany bed frame. Julian Vance did not write a single line of code in that past life. I did. I built his empire while he abused me in the shadows to cover up his own intellectual bankruptcy and rampant IP theft. And you were so blinded by greed, so desperate to steal my perfect, glossy life, that you threw yourself headfirst right into his cage. Her knees buckled. Gravity claimed her. Chloe collapsed onto the edge of the mattress, the shredded remains of her bridal magazine scattered around her ankles like fallen snow. You, the word barely escaped her lips. You coded it. You were the Silicon Valley genius, I whispered, delivering the final, crushing blow. And now I am Omni Solutions. I released the software that bankrupted him yesterday. I didn't steal your life, Chloe. I simply refused to surrender my brain this time around. A sound clawed its way out of Chloe's throat, a hollow, agonizing keen that was neither a scream nor a sob. It was the absolute auditory frequency of a woman realizing she had meticulously orchestrated her own destruction. I turned my back on her. The soles of my designer heels clicked against the hardwood floor in a rhythmic, unhurried cadence. I did not look back as I exited the Thorne estate, stepping out into the crisp, biting chill of the autumn afternoon. Later that evening, the Pacific Heights mansion was encased in a torrential downpour. The rain lashed against the triple-paned, reinforced glass of the library windows, a chaotic percussion that failed to penetrate the absolute stillness of Sebastian's sanctum. I stood in the shadowed threshold of the open doorway. Sebastian paced the length of the Persian rug. The ambient amber light from the brass reading lamps cast sharp, predatory shadows across the sharp planes of his jaw. He held a crystal tumbler of Macallan in his right hand. The ice clinked sharply against the glass, a staccato rhythm betraying a rare, deeply submerged frustration. "This ghost architect is a phantom," Sebastian muttered, his voice a low, vibrating rumble aimed at the rain-slicked window. "He refuses to meet in person. His legal counsel acts as an impenetrable brick wall. They are turning down a $2 billion buyout, Arya. $2 billion. It makes no logical sense unless they are planning to completely destabilize Cross Capital." I remained in the doorway, my pulse hammering a steady, controlled rhythm against my ribs. I had built Omni Solutions to eradicate Julian Vance. I had not built it to wage a protracted war of attrition against my own husband. Sebastian had provided the capital, the platinum sanctuary, and the impenetrable shield of his name. I owed him the ledger's balance. I owed him the truth. I crossed the threshold, my footsteps entirely silenced by the thick wool of the rug. "Sebastian," I said evenly, "they aren't trying to take you down. They are waiting for the right terms." He stopped pacing. He turned slowly, his winter sky eyes narrowing by a fraction of a millimeter. The ice in his glass settled. "How could you possibly know that?" Sebastian asked, the analytical machinery of his mind instantly engaging. "The financial press has zero insight into their board. My own intelligence division cannot bypass their firewalls." I did not answer him with words. I turned and walked toward the antique iron reinforced safe concealed behind a mahogany panel in the corner of the library. I inputted the 12-digit biometric passcode. The heavy internal bolts retracted with a deep metallic thud. I reached inside and withdrew a thick, black leather-bound portfolio. I turned back to the center of the room. Sebastian watched my every microscopic movement, the predatory tension returning to his broad shoulders. I approached his massive, dark oak desk. The portfolio weighed exactly 3.4 pounds. The Italian calfskin was cool and pebbled against the pads of my fingers. I lifted it above the polished grain of his desk. The brass hinges of the binder caught the amber light of the desk lamp, glinting like a drawn blade. I lowered it. The impact of the heavy leather striking the solid oak produced a dull, resonant thwack that seemed to suck the ambient oxygen from the room. I did not release it immediately. I pressed my palms flat against the black leather, pushing it forward. The friction of the calfskin sliding across the varnished wood produced a low, static hiss. It moved exactly 18 inches, coming to a halt, perfectly centered on his leather blotter, entirely mirroring the spatial geometry of the operational contract he had slid across the glass coffee table to me on our wedding night. The scent of his Tom Ford oud wood mixed heavily with the distinct metallic odor of freshly laser-printed ink trapped inside the leather binding. This was the nuclear launch code. This was the dismantling of the transactional marriage. I lifted my hands, retreating half a step. The trap was set. The veil was lifted. Sebastian set his whiskey tumbler down. A single drop of condensation ran down the crystal curvature, pooling on a cork coaster. He stepped up to the desk. He reached out with a large, heavily veined hand, his thumb catching the brass clasp. He flipped the portfolio open. Resting on top was the master key sequence for the Ether Protocol's encryption. Directly beneath it were the pristine, embossed incorporation papers from the state of Delaware. Sebastian's eyes, trained to process complex financial models in milliseconds, darted across the dense legalese. They scanned the corporate structure, bypassing the registered agent, driving directly toward the ultimate beneficial ownership clause. His eyes stopped. Listed there in stark, undeniable black ink was the title of sole proprietor, followed by my legal signature, Aria Thorne Cross. The silence in the library became a physical weight. I watched the microscopic physiological changes in the man who terrorized Wall Street. The stoic, impenetrable CEO mask did not just slip, it violently shattered. The rigid tension in his jaw slackened. The cold, calculating light in his eyes dissolved into an expression of profound, earth-shattering awe. He slowly lifted his gaze from the documents, meeting my eyes. "You," he breathed. The single syllable carried a specific gravity I had never heard in his voice. "It was you? The phantom unicorn of Silicon Valley," I said, my voice steady, my posture perfectly aligned. "Is your wife—" I waited for the anger. I waited for the betrayal of the deception, the furious roar of a titan realizing a Trojan horse had been sleeping in his east wing. Instead, a low, rich laugh escaped his chest. It was a dark, magnificent sound. "I have spent my entire life surrounded by parasites trying to siphon my influence," Sebastian murmured, stepping around the massive desk. He closed the distance between us until the heat radiating from his chest ghosted against my silk blouse. He reached out, his large, warm hands gently gripping my shoulders. His thumb brushed a stray lock of hair behind my ear, a touch so agonizingly gentle it sent a sharp electrical jolt down my spine. "I thought I was acquiring a fragile socialite to stabilize my board," he whispered fiercely, his voice thick with a sudden, overwhelming emotion. "Instead, I brought a queen into my house who quietly conquered my entire industry from her bedroom." He pulled me flush against his chest. his arms wrapped around me in a crushing, absolute embrace, burying his face in the curve of my neck. It was not the transactional hold of an acquiring CEO, it was the embrace of absolute, unshakable reverence. "Keep the patents," Sebastian promised into my skin, the vibration of his vocal cords transferring directly into my collarbone. "They are yours, but God help me, Aria. I am never letting you go." That night, the heavy oak doors between our suites remained wide open. The transactional marriage was officially dead, replaced by a ruthless, impenetrable partnership forged in fire. But outside the fortified walls of the Pacific Heights estate, a cornered rat was bleeding out. Julian Vance, facing imminent ruin and an impending federal probe, sat behind the wheel of a rented heavy SUV in the torrential rain. His bloodshot eyes stared at the GPS tracker he had illegally slipped beneath the bumper of my armored Audi. The ghosts of the past were not entirely buried. November 2020. The sky above San Francisco was a bruised, heavy purple, bloated with an impending Pacific storm. The coastal air sweeping into the city tasted sharp, laced with ozone and the distinct metallic tang of cold rain. Inside the fortified walls of Cross Capitol, the atmosphere was highly pressurized, charged with the kinetic energy of a total market realignment. Sebastian and I had spent the last 2 weeks finalizing the architectural framework of our public merger. November 2020. The sky above San Francisco was a bruised, heavy purple, bloated with an impending Pacific storm. The coastal air sweeping into the city tasted sharp, laced with ozone and the distinct metallic tang of cold rain. Inside the fortified walls of Cross Capitol, the atmosphere was highly pressurized, charged with the kinetic energy of a total market realignment. Sebastian and I had spent the last 2 weeks finalizing the architectural framework of our public merger. Omni Solutions was no longer a blind ghost. It was preparing to permanently integrate with the Cross dynasty. We left the elite venture capital gala at the St. Regis early. The ambient, chaotic flashing of the paparazzi cameras along the red carpet had triggered a dull, persistent ache behind my right eye. Sebastian's Maybach was undergoing a scheduled security audit, so we took my vehicle, a heavily modified, armored Audi A8L Security. I sat behind the leather-wrapped steering wheel, relishing the quiet, isolated hum of the W12 engine. The acoustic dampening of the cabin was absolute. Sebastian sat in the passenger seat, his massive frame comfortably angled toward me, scrolling through a sequence of encrypted legal briefs on an iPad. The rhythmic, hypnotic thump-thump of the windshield wipers cutting through the intensifying rain was the only sound bridging the space between us. We turned onto a desolate, winding stretch of the Pacific Coast Highway that skirted the rocky cliffs south of the city limits, a shortcut leading up to the coastal perimeter of our estate. The road was slick, the asphalt reflecting the meager light in fractured, oily streaks. I glanced into the rearview mirror. A pair of high beams flared, violently illuminating the dark cabin of the Audi. The harsh white light seared across my retinas. An older model, heavy-duty SUV was riding my bumper. It wasn't just tailgating, it was surging forward in erratic, aggressive bursts, closing a 20-foot gap to a terrifying 6 inches, repeatedly kissing the edge of my blind spot. A sudden, paralyzing cold injected itself directly into my cervical spine, bleeding rapidly down into my extremities. The ambient temperature in the climate-controlled cabin seemed to plummet to absolute zero. The distinct phantom stench of vaporized synthetic leather and carbonized skin flooded my olfactory receptors. The fire, the crushed metal, the smell of burning rubber. The PTSD did not arrive as a memory, it arrived as a physical manifestation. The muscles in my forearms locked. My grip on the steering wheel tightened until the knuckles turned a stark, bloodless white. I could not inhale. The oxygen in the cabin had been replaced by ash. Aria? Sebastian's voice cut through the rising static in my brain. The iPad hit the floor mats with a dull thud. The ruthless CEO had instantly registered the violent, unnatural rigidity of my posture. The cold detachment he projected to the world evaporated, replaced by a hyper-focused, lethal alertness. "What is it?" he demanded, his hand reaching across the center console. "Someone is following us," I shouted. The words tore from my throat, sounding sharp and terrified. Before Sebastian could command me to accelerate, the SUV behind us violently swerved across the double yellow line. The roaring engine of the heavy vehicle screamed over the sound of the rain, accelerating until it pulled parallel to the driver's side of the Audi. I turned my head, my cervical vertebrae grinding together. Through the rain-streaked window of the SUV, illuminated by the sickly green glow of his dashboard, was Julian Vance. His face was a mask of unhinged homicidal rage. He was unshaven, the stubble casting dark, desperate shadows across his hollow cheeks. His jaw was clenched so tight I imagined I could hear the enamel cracking. He did not have Chloe in the car this time, but his psychological state was identical. The charismatic visionary was gone. This was a feral animal backed into a corner by a mountain of bridge loans and an impending SEC indictment. He had lost his fake empire, and his shattered narcissistic ego demanded that the woman who exposed his intellectual bankruptcy pay the ultimate price. He locked eyes with me through the ballistic glass. He opened his mouth, screaming something lost to the torrential rain, his facial muscles twisting into a grotesque sneer. Then Julian jerked his steering wheel hard to the right. The heavy steel frame of the SUV slammed directly into the side of the Audi. The kinetic impact was a localized earthquake. The deafening, metallic crunch of the collision vibrated through the floorboards, shooting directly up through the soles of my shoes. The Audi fishtailed violently, the tires losing traction on the slick, rain-soaked asphalt. I screamed. The sound was involuntary, ripped from my lungs as the sudden memory of crushed ribs superimposed itself entirely over reality. We were going to crash. We were going to burn. The timeline was fixing itself. Sebastian reacted instantly. With a loud roar, he lunged across the wide center console. His massive left hand clamped down onto the steering wheel directly above my locked fingers. The sheer physical power of his grip was stabilizing, a gravitational anchor overriding my paralysis. He forced the wheel against the violent skid, wrestling the 3-ton armored vehicle back into a straight trajectory. Julian rammed us again. This impact was significantly harder, aiming precisely for the rear quarter panel, attempting to induce a PIT maneuver. The Audi shuddered, the chassis groaning under the immense lateral force. Julian was trying to push us over the shallow concrete barrier toward the steep, rocky embankment that dropped vertically into the churning black Pacific Ocean below. "He is trying to kill us," I stated firmly, the trauma of the past life clashing with my calculated logic. I was trapped in a metal cage, fighting to escape the fire. "Not today," Sebastian growled. His voice vibrated with a lethal, terrifying calm, the absolute certainty of a predator defending its mate. Sebastian's winter sky eyes snapped from the erratic SUV to the winding road ahead. Approximately 200 yards up, the highway narrowed sharply onto a reinforced concrete suspension bridge. The shoulder disappeared entirely, leaving only heavy, industrial concrete pillars anchoring the structure to the cliffs. "Aria," Sebastian commanded, his voice slicing through my panic like a scalpel. "When I say go, you hit the brakes. You do not hesitate. You floor the brake pedal." "Sebastian, we'll spin out," I choked, fighting the instinct to accelerate away from the threat. "Trust me," he roared, his eyes locked dead onto the hood of Julian's SUV holding parallel to our driver's side door. We hurtled toward the narrow bridge. The rain slashed horizontally across the windshield. Julian's engine whined at the red line. He was dropping back slightly, aligning his heavy front bumper with our rear axle, preparing for the final, fatal ram that would shatter our traction and send the Audi vaulting over the low concrete barrier into the abyss. "Now!" Sebastian bellowed. I did not think. I completely surrendered my survival instinct to the man beside me. I slammed both feet onto the wide brake pedal, driving it directly into the floorboard with every ounce of physical strength in my legs. The Audi's anti-lock braking system engaged with a violent mechanical stutter. The reinforced calipers clamped down onto the carbon ceramic rotors. The massive armored tires bit aggressively into the wet asphalt. The deceleration forces were catastrophic. My body slammed violently forward, the seatbelt locking across my chest with a bone-jarring impact, snapping my neck forward. Julian, hyper-focused entirely on executing the ramming maneuver, had his right foot firmly planted on the accelerator pedal. When the Audi suddenly, violently decelerated and vanished from his peripheral vision, Julian's violent swerve to the right met nothing but empty, rain-slicked air. He lost control instantly. The heavy, unarmored SUV hydroplaned, the tires completely detaching from the asphalt. The vehicle spun wildly across the wet lanes, a 3-ton missile completely devoid of trajectory. He slammed head-on into the reinforced concrete pillar of the bridge. The sound of the impact echoed through the rainy night, a sickening, familiar noise. It was the horrific crunch of heavy-gauge steel folding upon itself. The SUV's hood crumpled like a discarded soda can against the immovable concrete. The windshield shattered outward in a million crystalline fragments. The rear axle lifted off the ground before slamming back down with a heavy, metallic thud. Smoke immediately began to pour from the crushed engine block, hissing violently as the torrential rain hit the superheated metal. I sat in the driver's seat of the Audi, which had skidded to a complete, stable halt 50 feet away from the wreckage. I was hyperventilating. Short, ragged gasps of air tore through my throat. My hands were practically fusees to the steering wheel. Tears streamed down my face, hot against my freezing skin. I am alive. I didn't burn. I am alive. Sebastian unbuckled his seatbelt in a flash of movement. He reached across the console, physically pulling my rigid hands off the steering wheel. He pulled my trembling body across the center divider, wrapping me in a crushing, protective embrace. He buried my face into the crook of his neck, his large hand cupping the back of my head, shielding my eyes from the smoking ruin ahead. "I've got you," Sebastian whispered fiercely into my hair. "You're safe. I have you, Aria." Sirens wailed in the distance, cutting through the rhythmic drumming of the rain. Sebastian's private security detail, which had been trailing us by a discreet mile, had already initiated contact with the federal authorities. I slowly turned my head, looking over Sebastian's broad shoulder. There was no fire this time. There was no explosion. There was just a broken man trapped in a cage of twisted metal of his own making. The timeline was finally, permanently severed. The ghost of my past had been exorcised on the slick asphalt of Big Sur. I buried my face back into the solid warmth of my husband's chest, listening to the strong, steady beat of his heart, and for the first time in 2 lifetimes, I felt completely and utterly free. The flashing red and blue lights of the arriving emergency vehicles painted the wet asphalt in chaotic, strobing neon. 50 yards away, paramedics deployed the jaws of life, tearing the crumpled driver's side door off its hinges to pry Julian Vance from the wreckage. As they hauled his broken body onto a stretcher, I knew the physical pain of his shattered femurs was nothing compared to the legal annihilation waiting for him. The FBI wasn't coming to the hospital to take his statement. They were coming to execute an arrest warrant for federal wire fraud. The flashing red and blue strobes of the emergency vehicles painted the wet asphalt in chaotic, strobing neon. I stood wrapped in Sebastian's heavy wool overcoat, the scent of charcoal and expensive detergent grounding me as my nervous system suffered a massive, delayed adrenaline crash. 50 yards away, the rhythmic metallic clack hiss of the jaws of life echoed through the Big Sur canyons. Paramedics were prying Julian Vance from the crumpled, smoking remains of his SUV. He was alive, though clearly shattered. As they loaded him onto the stretcher, his neck stabilized by a thick plastic brace, our eyes met through the deluge. There was no remorse in his gaze, only the feral, pathetic hatred of a cornered rat. He opened his mouth, his lips twisting to scream a final curse, but a paramedic placed an oxygen mask over his face, silencing him with a hiss of medical-grade air. "Don't look at him," Sebastian murmured. His arm remained a permanent, secure anchor around my waist, turning me away from the wreckage. "He is a ghost, Aria. He can never touch you again." Sebastian was true to his word. By dawn, the narrative was locked down. The legal machinery of Cross Capital did not merely respond, it executed. Julian wasn't just facing charges for aggravated assault and attempted vehicular manslaughter. Sebastian's forensic accountants had spent the night anonymously forwarding Julian's forged bridge loan documents to the SEC. The FBI had been waiting for the exact moment Julian hit that concrete pillar. The reality of attempting to murder the wife of a man who owns the city's debt is a clinical, absolute erasure from society. I spent the following week in a state of icy productivity. While Julian lay in a high security hospital wing under federal guard, I orchestrated the final liquidation of Vance Innovations. Every patent Julian had attempted to file, corrupted versions of my own architecture, was challenged in federal court and struck down. A class action lawsuit, triggered by the investors Julian had defrauded, stripped him of his last remaining personal assets. By Friday, Julian Vance didn't even own the clothes he had bled in. I made one final trip to the Thorne family estate. The house I grew up in felt entirely different now, smaller, draftier, like a stage set after the play has ended. I found my father in his study, looking 10 years older as he pored over a mountain of legal bills. I quietly placed a cashier's check on his mahogany desk. It was an amount precisely calculated to pay off the family's remaining debts and secure his retirement. It was the final transaction I would ever make with Arthur Thorne. He looked at the zeros, then up at me with tears in his exhausted eyes. I raised a hand to stop his gratitude. "We are even now, Father," I said, my voice smooth and devoid of friction. "I have purchased my freedom. Enjoy your silence." I found Chloe in the sunroom. The contrast between the woman sitting in the wicker chair and the arrogant golden girl who had demanded to marry a visionary was staggering. She was painfully thin, her skin sallow and devoid of makeup. She wore an oversized, faded gray sweater, her blonde hair tied back in a messy, uncared for knot. She was staring blankly at the frost creeping up the glass panes. When she heard my footsteps, she didn't flinch. She just turned her head slowly, her eyes hollow. "They offered me a plea deal, too," Chloe whispered, her voice raspy, "for the forged signatures on Julian's startup loans. I had to testify against him. I'm serving 3 years of probation." I stood a few feet away, my hands clasped in front of my cashmere coat. I felt no pity, but I also felt no vindictiveness. The burning anger that had fueled my rebirth had finally extinguished, leaving behind a cold, clear peace. "I came to say goodbye, Chloe," I said. She let out a hollow, bitter laugh, a single tear finally escaping and tracing a slow path down her pale cheek. "Goodbye? Where are you going, Arya? Back to your palace? Back to the empire I handed you?" "You didn't hand me anything," I corrected her gently. "You threw me to the wolves, Chloe. You just didn't realize I knew how to lead the pack." I turned to leave, the sound of my heels clicking against the hardwood floor with a sharp, final cadence. "Arya!" she shrieked, scrambling off the wicker chair. "Will you ever forgive me? For the crash? For before?" I paused at the threshold. I thought of the burning SUV from my past life. I thought of the suffocating heat, the smell of my own skin, and her mad, jealous eyes as the gas tank ignited. "No, Chloe," I answered honestly, not looking back. "I will never forgive you, but I am finally going to forget you." I walked out of the Thorne home for the last time, stepping into the crisp November air where Sebastian's armored Audi was waiting. The grand finale occurred on a Tuesday, exactly 1 year since my rebirth. The Cross Capital boardroom was crowded with a different kind of audience today, the global financial press. The air was thick with the ozone of 100 humming cameras and the electric tension of a historic announcement. Sebastian and I stood behind the scenes in the executive lounge. He adjusted the cuff of his charcoal suit, his gaze fixed on me. He wasn't looking at my emerald silk dress or the flawless diamonds at my throat. He was looking at me with a profound, unshakable reverence. "Are you ready?" he asked. "The code is compiled, Sebastian," I replied, the ghost of a smile touching my lips. "The system is flawless." We stepped out into the light. The blinding white flashes of the cameras were a relentless, strobe-like assault, but I did not blink. I did not flinch. My pulse remained a flat, steady line. Sebastian took his place at the podium. He stood imposing and untouchable, the titan of industry. Cross Capital has always prided itself on unparalleled efficiency. Sebastian addressed the sea of reporters, his voice a commanding, resonant baritone. "Today, we don't just secure the future of global logistics, we redefine it. And the visionary behind this new era is not me." He turned, his winter sky eyes softening in a way that the cameras frantically tried to capture. He extended his hand to me. "It is my wife, Arya Thorne, the lead architect of the Ether Protocol and the founder of Omni Solutions." I stepped up to the podium, placing my hand in his. The warmth of his palm against mine was a solid, physical anchor. The applause was a deafening, distant roar. I looked out at the sea of reporters, the flashing lights, and the world that lay entirely at my feet. I didn't see Julian's sneering face. I didn't see Chloe's jealous glare. I only saw the empire I had built with my own two hands, standing beside a man who loved me not for my compliance, but for my brilliant, ruthless mind. Later that night, long after the celebrations had ended and the press releases had been sent to every major outlet in the hemisphere, Sebastian and I stood on the balcony of our Pacific Heights penthouse. The San Francisco fog was rolling in, a thick, white velvet blanket snaking between the skyscrapers. The air was crisp, tasting of approaching winter, completely devoid of ash and smoke. Sebastian slipped his arms around my waist from behind, resting his chin on my shoulder. "We survived Tuesday," he murmured softly. "We did more than survive, Sebastian," I replied, leaning back into his solid warmth. I thought about the ledger of my life. The debt of the past had been paid in full. The predatory algorithm had found its mark. Julian Vance was sitting in a federal holding facility in Colorado, his broken legs pinned with titanium, facing 25 years of silence. Chloe was a footnote in a receptionist's log. Fate is not a script written by the stars. It is a ledger of our own choices. Chloe believed that stealing another's path would guarantee her the sun, but she merely inherited the shadows she was too blind to see. I, on the other hand, had learned that a cold exterior often guards a fierce, unshakable loyalty. I watched the distant lights of a cargo ship moving slowly beneath the Golden Gate Bridge, its path optimized by the very code I had written in the dark. The timeline was rewritten, the system was flawless, and for the first time in two lifetimes, my future belonged entirely to me. I turned in Sebastian's arms, reaching up to trace the line of his jaw. He looked at me with a dark, intense hunger, not the hunger for an acquisition, but for an equal. "Take me inside, Sebastian," I whispered. As we stepped back into the glass and steel sanctuary of our home, the heavy doors clicked shut, sealing out the noise of the world below. The play was over. The Queen had taken the board. In a maximum security federal facility 1,200 miles away, Julian Vance stared at a flickering fluorescent light in his 6 by 9 cell. He had 24 years and 11 months of Tuesdays left to contemplate the exact moment he had chosen to ram an armored Audi. But in the penthouse above the fog, Aria Thorncross finally closed her eyes, and for the first time, she did not dream of fire.